Today, we're diving into an absolute heavyweight philosophical bout, one that literally birthed the modern world as we know it. We're going to unpack how a handful of radical thinkers completely reimagined the relationship between people and power, sparking actual revolutions and toppling kings. And honestly, it all boils down to one epic clash of political views between two men, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So let's get right into it.
To really appreciate this debate, I want you to try a little thought experiment with me. Imagine just for a second a world completely without laws. No police, no courts, no written rules whatsoever. Would people just naturally cooperate with each other, or would it look like some post-apocalyptic movie instantly descending into absolute chaos? Answering that single question, why do we actually need government in the first place, was the absolute obsession of 17th century thinkers. But to understand their answers, we first have to take a quick look at the era they were living in.
And that era is the Enlightenment, often called the Age of Reason. This was a massive European intellectual movement spanning the late 17th and 18th centuries, and it grew directly out of things like the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. But here is what's truly radical about it. While the Scientific Revolution applied reason to things like, astronomy and physics, Enlightenment philosophers decided to point that exact same logic directly at government and society. They started emphasizing individualism rather than just blindly following tradition.
It sounds basic to us now, but man, what a wild concept back then, right? These Enlightenment thinkers fundamentally rejected established authority. They firmly upheld the freedom of individuals to just think for themselves, which is perfectly captured by the philosopher René Descartes when he famously declared, "I think, therefore I am." But why does this matter so much? Well, for centuries, the ultimate political view was the divine right of kings, this unquestionable tradition that God handpicked the ruler. By insisting that humans could discover the truth through rational thought, the Enlightenment threw a massive, dangerous wrench into the whole machinery of absolute power.
And that brings us to the first contender in our philosophical bout, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was one of the very first thinkers to apply pure reason directly to the problem of politics. But based on his own observations of human nature, his conclusions were, well, pretty dark. He published a wildly influential book called Leviathan in 1651. Hobbes argued that people are basically naturally selfish, cruel, and greedy. He really believed humanity's default setting is just this restless, never-ending desire for power.
Hobbes believed that if we were left in a state of nature, that lawless thought experiment we did just a minute ago, people would constantly be in conflict. Without strict rules, we would literally just tear each other apart. He famously wrote that life in this natural state would be nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, Hobbes viewed humanity as a violent reality show without the cameras. It's a highly pessimistic view for sure, but to him, it was just rational observation.
So how on earth do you fix a society made up of selfish, greedy people? Hobbes' solution was simple, but incredibly strict. Governments were created specifically to protect people from their own selfishness. Because human nature is just so volatile, Hobbes believed you needed a massive, terrifying, unquestionable authority, a literal leviathan, to keep everyone in line and prevent total chaos. In his political view, absolute government was just a necessary evil to ensure our survival.
But, a few decades go by, and a major challenger enters the ring. Enter John Locke. In 1690, Locke wrote a hugely influential work called Two Treatises of Government. Now, if Hobbes was the ultimate pessimist, Locke was the optimist. Locke completely disagreed with Hobbes' dark view of human nature. He offered a totally different take on why power exists and what government is actually supposed to do for us.
Now, this is where the modern world truly begins to take shape. Locke introduced this absolute game changer called the social contract. His political view was literally the exact opposite of Hobbes. He said government wasn't there to control you, but to protect your inherent natural rights, specifically your rights to life, liberty, and property. People willingly give the government the power to rule in exchange for this protection, which creates the consent of the governed. And the truly radical part? Locke argued that if a government fails to protect those rights, the contract is completely broken, and the people have every right to overthrow it.
Okay, let's put these two titans side by side for a second, because this is the defining political debate of the era. On one side, you've got Hobbes arguing that humans are inherently selfish and desperately need absolute government to protect them from themselves. On the other side, Locke argues that humans have inherent natural rights, and they only form a social contract to protect those rights. Hobbes demands authority for the sake of order, Locke demands liberty and the consent of the people.
This single fundamental disagreement over human nature is the engine that drove the rest of the Enlightenment.
So, what actually happened next? Well, Locke's ideas about natural rights and the consent of the governed proved to be incredibly contagious. Thinkers all across Europe started gathering in these informal meetings called salons, and fun fact, many of these were actually organized and funded by brilliant women, and they would debate these concepts for hours on end. This foundation built by Locke rippled outward, inspiring a whole new generation to start drawing up the blueprints for a truly free society. These later thinkers took Locke's political view of protecting liberty and started designing the actual mechanics to prevent a Hobbesian absolute ruler from ever taking over. You had Montesquieu looking at how to stop a government from becoming too powerful, giving us the separation of powers so no one person held all the cards. Voltaire championed freedom of thought, Cesare Beccaria focused on fair trials and ending torture, and Mary Wollstonecraft pushed the boundaries of equality even further. Let's break a few of these down to see how they map directly to our rights today.
Let's look at Cesare Beccaria, an Italian philosopher. Back in the Middle Ages, the torture of accused criminals on awful devices like the rack or thumbscrews was completely normal, a very Hobbesian reality, honestly. Well, Beccaria strongly argued against this brutal tradition. He stated that punishment should only deter crime, torture should literally never be used, and capital punishment should be totally abolished. His push for a fair and speedy trial directly influenced the U.S. Constitution's 6th and 8th Amendments, protecting us against cruel and unusual punishment. Then, of course, we have Voltaire, a French writer who just loved to poke fun at old religious ideas. He was deeply concerned with religious tolerance and freedom of speech, which is famously captured in the ultimate Enlightenment ideal, "I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." For him, it wasn't just about protecting individual thoughts, it was about building a whole society that tolerated different beliefs, completely pushing back against authoritarian control. Because of Voltaire's massive influence, these concepts became the absolute bedrock of the First Amendment.
And crucially, this pursuit of individual rights definitely didn't stop with men. In 1792, an English writer named Mary Wollstonecraft published A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. She argued that Locke's natural rights shouldn't just apply to men. Women deserved the exact same opportunities. Wollstonecraft fiercely believed that education was the absolute key for women wanting equality and freedom. And she went on to inspire so many later leaders of the women's rights movement.
Okay, so up to this point, we've got a lot of brilliant people sitting around in salons, writing thick books, and having high-level debates about Hobbes's need for authority versus Locke's demand for natural rights. But what happens when these ideas leave the fancy parlor rooms? What happens when everyday people decide they actually want to cash in on Locke's social contract? Well, the world literally catches on fire.
The Enlightenment ended up sparking massive, world-altering revolutions in both America and France, where citizens literally overthrew their kings. But these two revolutions played out very differently. When the Americans rebelled in 1775, they pulled straight from Locke's political playbook, pointing specifically to the king's abuse of their rights. France, however, took a much different path, one that completely tested the limits of both Locke's optimism and Hobbes' pessimism.
In America, the Founding Fathers essentially used this whole movement as a literal blueprint for a new nation. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was directly echoing John Locke's ideas on natural rights. When they wrote the Constitution, they used Montesquieu's idea to separate the government into a legislative Congress, an executive president, and a judicial court system. They encoded Voltaire's free speech and Beccaria's speedy trials directly into the Bill of Rights. It was quite literally Locke's vision made into the law of the land.
But across the Atlantic, the French Revolution showed a much darker side of dismantling authority. In 1789, they adopted the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, demanding liberty and equality. But very soon, terrible violence erupted. Thousands of people were beheaded on the guillotine. The bloody chaos brought a really dark end to the Enlightenment dream of pure reason. And it's the ultimate historical irony, isn't it? In getting rid of their absolute king, the French accidentally proved Thomas Hobbes right about just how brutal the state of nature could be without a Leviathan to keep order.
And that actually brings us full circle for this explainer. We absolutely live in a world built by John Locke's ideals. We value our liberty, our property, and our free speech. We demand a social contract. But at the same time, governments still wield immense power. Police forces maintain order, and laws govern our every move to keep us from descending into chaos. Pretty much exactly as Thomas Hobbes warned we would. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When you look at the modern world around you today, who do you think truly won the debate? Are we living in Locke's dream of natural liberty, or are we secretly relying on Hobbes' absolute authority just to survive? Thanks for exploring this clash of ideas with me today.